All right. Yeah, thanks for coming back, everyone. Can you all hear me okay? All right, great. Yeah, so my name's Meghna. I am one of the R2s in the health equity pathway. And I was trying to think of a session to talk about to help kind of like balance out kind of the discussions we've been having about race and medicine. And I wanted to take a slightly different approach from Connor and Michael and talk about underrepresented minorities and diversity in undergraduate medical training. Okay, today's the date, okay. So the objectives for this talk are, first of all, describing trends for admission of underrepresented minorities to medical schools. The data I have starts at 2002, so talking from there. But then we'll examine the structural, institutional, interpersonal barriers resulting in exclusion of minoritized groups from medical training. Then discussing bias and microaggressions that underrepresented minorities experience during medical training. And I do want to end with exploring some solutions to reduce disparities and retain underrepresented minorities in medicine. Just like Connor, I also wanted to take a moment to reflect on my positionality and kind of what motivated me to come up with this topic. I am an able-bodied, cisgendered, heterosexual woman of color from an upper middle class background, and I'm a member of a minority that not very probably is overrepresented in medicine. And I do have interest in diversity, equity, and inclusion from my lived experiences as a woman of color and first-generation American, but I also have a lot of privilege, I think especially in the medical field because of my above identities. My hope with this talk is to uplift the voices and experiences of underrepresented minorities, because asking exclusively members of those groups or those identities to explain their experiences is an unfair burden on them, and it does require all of us to have an awareness of health disparities and inequities that our colleagues may face in order to change the culture of medicine. And of course, I still have much to learn about this, and I'm very open to feedback. So I've been throwing around the term underrepresented minorities in medicine a lot, and I wanted to take a moment to talk about who these are. In 2003, the AAMC put out a definition, which was racial and ethnic populations that are underrepresented in the medical profession relative to their numbers in the general population. And I think this is a good definition because it highlights that like maybe local and regional representation numbers. So this can include maybe, for example, Southeast Asians who are underrepresented in medicine, even though Asians as a whole racial category or demographic are overrepresented. But I do also want to point out that before 2003, the AAMC definition was very specifically defined underrepresented minorities as African Americans, Mexican Americans, Native Americans, Alaskan Natives, Natives Hawaiians, and mainland Puerto Ricans. And a lot of the research I have is looking at admission trends and systemic bias and oppression that these groups face. So I will try to specify when I'm talking about one particular group versus underrepresented minorities as a whole. So why this matters is that a lack of diversity in medicine is a form of institutional racism. We already have heard a lot about the various forms of bias and racism and oppression that exist in the medical field, partially from Connor and Michael's talks and also just from being members of the medical field here, and especially in the past few years have come to realize more about how inequitable medicine really is. And to some extent, we can do a lot of brainstorming to try to fix medicine on our own, but a huge part of that is making sure that the voices of underrepresented minorities are included in this. And without that, we won't be able to make medicine more equitable. Also, studies have shown that there are benefits, like societal benefits, specifically related to increased underrepresentation, the increased representation of underrepresented minorities in medicine. we've seen that doctors in underrepresented minorities are more likely to work in primary care. They're more likely to work with patients from vulnerable backgrounds, more likely to care for patients who are uninsured or on Medicaid. And one study has also shown that patients who share a racial identity with their doctors accept more preventative treatments, show better awareness of medical risks, and adhere more closely to doctors' instructions over time. There's also benefits of a diverse student body for medical colleagues and learners. A study showed that doctors who, white students within the highest quintile for student body, racial and ethnic diversity in medical school, so white students at very diverse schools who also experienced a very positive racial environment, they showed more likely to rate themselves as highly prepared to care for minority patients. And they also were more likely to have strong attitudes for endorsing equitable access to care. So clear benefits that we see to all learners when student body is more diverse. And then of course, diverse faculty members improve experiences for students from underrepresented minorities. The flip side to this is often called a minority tax, which is when faculty from underrepresented minorities have an excess burden almost placed on them to work in DEI and to mentor students, and they're often not compensated fairly for this work, but I will talk more about that later. Okay, so understanding the trends. So here I have a study from JAMA in 2019, which talks about, which looks at whether some guidelines put in by the Liaison Committee of Medical Education in 2009, which basically made diversity a requirement for medical schools getting accredited. This study was to analyze whether that had any impact on diversity in medicine. And basically what this shows is there's a representation quotient on the vertical axis. And if that is less than 1, it suggests, and greater than 1, it suggests this group is overrepresented among medical school matriculants, and less than 1 represents the subgroup is underrepresented. So as you can see here, so American Indian and Native American, Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander, African American, and Hispanic students are consistently underrepresented in medicine, and those trends do not change over the 20 years of data that's represented here. And even though the proportion of individuals identifying as Black, Hispanic, or Native American and Pacific Islander have grown in medical schools, when you look at that percentage growth and as compared to the rest of the population, that change has actually stayed stable, and the proportion of medical students entering medical school from underrepresented minorities has actually dropped from 15% to 13% over this time frame. So by 2017, Hispanic medical school matriculants were underrepresented by 70%, Black male matriculants by 60%, and Black female matriculants by nearly 40%. So basically, we're not doing a very good job at recruiting underrepresented minorities to medical school. So next, I want to kind of talk about why that's the case. So I'm going to give everyone about 90 seconds here to maybe write down what challenges pre-medical students face when applying to medical school. The next portion of this question is, how do these challenges disproportionately affect underrepresented minorities? Feel free to include both in the chat. Start, yeah, anytime. I see lots of dollar signs. That's definitely a big part of it. Not knowing how the process works, money and mentorship. Thank you, Joey. Shadowing experiences. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, Connor, finding mentors. Absolutely. Prestige of undergraduate education. Yeah. All right, I'll give it a couple more seconds. Hidden curriculum, standardized testing, yeah, research experience, lack of research and volunteer opportunities if someone has to work through college, yeah. Okay, I'm going to move on at this point, but I think these are all amazing, these are all excellent contributions. Thank you, everyone. Yeah, this is all, sorry, this is a little text heavy, but these are all kind of have been proven to be areas that are barriers for underrepresented underrepresented minorities in medical school admissions. Structural barriers are, of course, the cost and length of medical training. We know that average household income for Latinx and African American families is lower than that for white families for many, many structural barriers and oppression. And that can make these costs and the length of training more burdensome. This also means that underrepresented minorities often have an increased debt burden. And then we know that underrepresented minorities, especially those who are coming from more impoverished areas or from rural areas, may not get the appropriate level of training in high school or before college to be prepared for the rigor of college or graduate studies. And many students in interviews have reported that gateway courses such as organic chemistry or calculus can be incredibly difficult and that they are not prepared adequately in high school for the rigor of these courses. Some institutional factors, which I am kind of thinking about institutional factors related to medical school admissions, definitely the lack of mentorship, which came up so often. Also, just this overemphasis on MCAT scores and GPA to determine the eligibility of medical training. This one, I think, becomes controversial because of course, doctors do need to perform well on their licensing exams, but even despite that, we see that MCAT scores and GPA are maybe unfairly overrepresented in medical school admissions criteria. And then, yeah, I think the prioritization of shadowing and volunteer experiences, this I didn't have data for, that's why they're the 2 stars there, but so much of the medical admissions process prioritizes unpaid work and students who have to support their family or pay for college often will choose to work in non-medical fields, and that is often seen as a detriment or a deficit. And along with this also, students who went to community college, that's often seen as a detriment in medical school admissions, but oftentimes that is the gateway by which underrepresented minorities are able to access higher education, and then that's held against them. And then these interpersonal issues, the studies I'm referring to are using implicit association tests, which are looking at, which can look at like white-black preference. And those studies show that a large majority of physicians have an implicit white preference, which a study out of Ohio showed that that could have played, that was found to be true in an admissions committee made up of medical students and faculty as well. And that may and probably is playing into admissions factors when it comes to which students are selected to matriculate to medical school. And then, of course, there is a lack of support for underrepresented minorities who experience bias and racism during training. Circle this because I want to talk about this next. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing and put a link in the chat really fast. Please go to this link, and I wanted everyone to participate in a poll everywhere. Okay. And then, so the question I am asking is, oops, how do I, there we go. Okay, is if you can briefly describe a time when you've experienced or witnessed bias or discrimination towards a colleague in medical training. And again, this can come from your experiences. This can be totally anonymous. Please do not feel like you need to share your name or any personal information. But I want to give everyone a couple minutes to kind of reflect on bias and discrimination they have experienced or witnessed in training. Is everyone able to access this? That's that comment in its entirety. I saw some other ones. Oh, patients asking women providers for snacks and water. Oof, people are assuming I was admitted only due to affirmative action. That is horrible. Wow, a co-resident was made fun of by an attending for their accent. That's pretty bad. Yeah, absolutely. This one I think is one we've seen or witnessed a lot. Ooh. Okay. Getting more pushback from nurses, yeah. Excused and others. Assuming the white male intern was senior resident. Okay. All right. I'm going to try to go over, scroll through all of these so that everyone can see them. Thank you all for everybody who shared experiences they've had. Lack of effort in learning names, guessing ethnicity, seeing some patients is difficult, patient asking to be cared for nurses without accents, certain traits as positive, and yeah, these are, thank you all so much for sharing. I'm not racist, but racist comment, a classic. Inappropriate sexual comments, amplified deficits. Yeah, okay, thank you all so much. Let me just a sec to get to my presentation. Okay, can everyone see my presentation now? Yeah, great, okay. So yeah, thank you all so much for sharing. Just to validate all of these experiences, I know that I have experienced some of these myself personally, and I think just like the diversity in responses and the sheer volume of responses here illustrates how often we see these problems in medicine. And I feel personally like I did get some training on how to address bias in medical school and have since gotten some in residency. And even then, so many of these issues and bias end up unaddressed in our interactions with patients or with other colleagues. Everything that everybody shared has also been studied to some extent and documented. In a 2020 study of family medicine physicians of color, 23% of the participants reported that a patient had directly refused care specifically due to their race. And while the physicians of color did not express higher rates of burnout or dropout from medical fields due to their experience of racism, a significant correlation was found between these microaggressions and symptoms of secondary traumatic stress. And then all the participants in this study reported experiencing significant racism from patients, colleagues, and institutions. This study did not specifically survey underrepresented minorities, but of the 70 physicians who were surveyed, 30% were Asian, 30% were Black or African American, and 30% were Hispanic, I believe. Multiple studies have also shown that in medical school, racial and ethnic minority group students receive worse performance evaluations and more negative comments on evaluations. Oftentimes the language used to describe used in performance evaluations has been shown to be different for white students and for students of color, which is likely related to bias and stereotyping. Where am I? Sorry, just a sec. Okay. Yeah, So another study that was a survey of Black students in medical schools reported that almost half of them had heard negative comments about Black patients during their placements from senior staff and residents, which just goes to show that so many students may witness or experience racism not directed towards them, but directed towards patients, and that can be really harmful as well. And then also there is just in general a concern that underrepresented medical students are not encouraged to participate in academic medicine or specialty medicine. For example, while 12.4% of US family medicine practitioners are ethnic minorities, only 0.8% of dermatologists are ethnic minorities. And I have to actually look at what minorities they were referring to in the study. I don't have that information. But basically, this goes to show kind of that at every level of training and in every aspect of training, there is some level of bias or discrimination or oppression, and that much of it ends up going unaddressed or is not handled well. And oftentimes, physicians and colleagues are the ones perpetuating the problem when you look at negative comments that many students have experienced hearing from senior staff. So at this point, I want to shift gears and talk a little bit more about solutions and progress that we are seeing in training. So this is a diagram that I took from a UCSF study or report on how to improve retention and recruitment of underrepresented minorities in medicine in California. It's a little confusing, but basically there were several facets they identified. The main action point that these studies identified was forming institutional partnerships with high schools, colleges, community colleges, and medical schools and hospitals. The goal was to identify and cultivate potential graduate applicants at partner institutions, and then provide resources and like longitudinal support for these students so that they continue to have support that they need throughout their training and their pre-medical courses. So much of this is required to be tailored and means prioritizing not just a student's academic achievement, but their emotional well-being, providing financial support, and making sure that they have a social support and community to help them succeed in medical schools. And then part of this also comes at the institutional level at medical schools when it comes to revising standards and curriculums to emphasize a holistic view and prioritize people's lived experiences and background and the diversity that they would bring of thought and experience to medical training. And then this last portion, engaging in faculty and institutional change, involves having faculty involvement with partner institutions, and also hiring more underrepresented minorities in faculty positions who can not just provide better care to patients at academic institutions, but who can also mentor students who are coming from similar backgrounds. And I would include that in this, that more implicit bias training and more training on racial awareness and diversity, equity, and inclusion needs to be included in medical school curriculums, because once students do come to medical school or come into their training, they should be in an environment that feels supportive and like a community, and not feel like they are minorities or minoritized or oppressed in their environments. I wanted to end with a quick word about 2021, because all of this research that I looked at was from 2021 or before. And actually in 2021, we did see a big change in medical school applications and matriculants, which I think is just a really interesting proof of concept. So in 2021, applicants to medical schools went up by about 18%. And there was a 41% increase in Black applicants, a 23% increase in Alaskan Native and American Native students, and a 25% increase in Hispanic and Latino applicants. And then this chart shows that the 2021 matriculating class was the most diverse ever. Black and African American students were the increase in matriculants was by 21%, so from 2,100 students matriculating in 2020 to 2,500 in 2021. We also see significant improvements in the numbers of Hispanic and Latino students and Native Hawaiian or other Pacific Islander students who matriculated to medical school in 2021. And then also other races or ethnicities, we saw a 4% increase in matriculants from that group. And the one downside is that we did see a drop in the number of American Indian and Alaska Native students matriculating to medical school, which maybe suggests that more research and interventions are needed to target recruiting and retaining trainees and colleagues from that particular group of people. Yeah, that is, I think just overall, I wanted to reflect on this. I think that the reason that we saw so much improvement in medical school admissions and changes in 2021 is partially because of the murder of George Floyd and the subsequent racial awakening that we saw in the US after that, where a lot more awareness was generated about discrimination and racism and institutional racism in so many areas of society, but especially in medicine. And also, I think that the other thing we saw in 2021 is that medical schools reduced a lot of the barriers to entering medical school, such as making interviews virtual and reducing the costs and demands of interviewing at medical schools. And I think this is proof positive that a combination of improving racial awareness and awareness of discrimination and bias, and also there's small interventions that can be done to make medical training easier to apply to or more accessible, that these can have a huge impact on diversifying our classes and making sure that underrepresented minorities do eventually become fairly represented in medicine. These are my sources. I'm happy to include some links in the chat about what sources I used. I think a lot of this was really interesting reading. I tried to use a mix of studies and also articles and interviews from underrepresented minorities talking about their experiences. And then I just wanted to include a quick plug for the health equity pathway. It's wonderful. Ryan Abe leads the pathway. She's a former UW chief and just an amazing human being. There's so much flexibility to pursue your interests in the context of health equity. Our month when I did this was in September, mid-September to mid-October, and we learned about like the history of discrimination and bias in many different arenas. Learned about research, quality improvement, institutional and societal advocacy, and community organizing, just to name a few things. The speakers and lecturers were all amazing, and there was lots of time to connect with co-residents and faculty who are interested in equity as well. So happy to put my email in the chat for anyone who has questions about this pathway. It was amazing. That was everything I have. Does anyone have any questions or thoughts they'd like to share?
Meghna, there's a comment in the chat from John about our program, specifically that we've seen some increased match of self-identified URM residents over the last 4 years through some intentional work, but are not where we want to be yet. And please, for anyone, feel free to reach out to program leadership privately or publicly if there are thoughts about what has worked or not worked in those efforts. And then a lot of gratitude for you and Connor and Michael and Ryan for leadership in the health equity pathway. Jaspreet is pointing out that UW did a study some years ago about racial ethnic disparities in clinical grading in medical school. That was Danny Lowe. Yep. And a question of if more work is being done in this area.
I really don't. I wish I did. I haven't. I didn't go to medical school here, so I'm not as familiar with a lot of the medical school faculty and maybe the work that they're doing. And I think when we were talking in our health equity pathway, we did talk about, we did meet a number of clinicians who are doing clinical research, looking at patient disparities, but I don't think we learned about some of the disparities research being done in medical training. But thank you so much for sharing this, Jaspreet. I'm definitely going to read this and try to learn more.
I just wanted to say something too, Magna. This was fantastic, and I think a really nice opportunity to step back. I also think about this as such a fantastic example of intersectionality personally, where some interesting data just came out too about how even URMs in medical training generally come from higher class backgrounds. I can find a study, but this was kind of in the last couple of weeks. And I think a lot about that as someone who trained at a state medical school and in a more rural state of Wisconsin, and how our school had a lot of medical students from state like schools, the little state schools, UW La Crosse, UW Eau Claire, and how, just as you mentioned, these biases against community college, there are real four-year institutions that people go to because they're affordable and close to home. And like in Wisconsin, that you have to be home to detassel the corn in the summer or milk the cows, like legitimately. And that there are real learners that like want to serve those communities. And I think especially as we move, I reflected a lot as I like move up in prestige institutions, like how there just seems to perpetuate these levels of bias. And I just have been reflecting a lot about class and socioeconomic status and the highly rural or the highly urban as like another opportunity for where bias exists. And I don't have like a question, more just a comment on how important this work is and how there's so many levels of bias and lack of representation in our medical like practitioners.
Yeah, I think that's such a good point, Nikki. And I didn't find research specifically talking about this, but I do think just anecdotally, I've noticed that as well, that many of my colleagues from underrepresented minorities do come from backgrounds that are more affluent or from higher socioeconomic backgrounds. And I really do think that there is, just from a personal experience applying to medical school, there's such a high barrier for admissions that I really do think it must feel almost impossible for students who are juggling other responsibilities or or who, do not have the time or the financial stability that they can commit to spending like 10 years in training. And it's extremely frustrating that there are so many barriers to incorporating more underrepresented minorities in medicine, and people from rural backgrounds and from other backgrounds. Yeah, I know I've seen research on like socioeconomic class of like physicians who are entering medical school, and I couldn't find that research when I was preparing this, but I think that's such an interesting point.
I can comment to the question about other research that's being done, if that's helpful for context. There is a lot of other research being done at a lot of institutions, and as you might guess, the heterogeneity of our educational process makes this complicated. For a school like Harvard or UCSF or a Vanderbilt to give up grades for very noble reasons in terms of reducing some of the issues about educational bias, it's easy for a school like that to do it versus a school that's not considered sort of top tier, whatever that means. And so schools struggle with this as they think about how do they also not disadvantage their own students in applying in the match to residency program. And then the other part to be aware of, we also have, as we're talking about intersectionality in different classes, there are also classes within residency programs, as you're all well aware, and rural training programs, smaller community programs also have to draw a lot from international medical graduates. And also many of them draw predominantly from osteopathic schools. And so there's also issues about how applicants from those locations are perceived as well. And so there's all sorts of bias in all kinds of ways. And for a school or a place to eliminate some of those isn't the answer for every place because of some of these biases that continue. And so this remains a really vexing and challenging situation, and not just, unfortunately, answered as easily as just saying, let's do away with grades or let's do away with board score or step scores and those sort of things.
That's fascinating. Yeah, thank you. I think it's just so, this is like a very complex topic, and I think to some extent requires examining like the institution of medical school and medical admissions as a whole. Some of the research I was looking at from this UCSF program was talking about combined BA MD programs and about how studies have shown that medical students would be just as prepared to be doctors with almost a 30% reduction in the duration of medical training, which I didn't include in my PowerPoint, but I thought was really fascinating and maybe represents that there are really large structural problems in how we teach medicine that end up excluding people from different backgrounds. And then Lindsay has this comment about programs weighing GPA based on schools, which is so fascinating. I didn't know that was the case. And I think that's really interesting because so much of that is probably then going based off of like the weight or the prestige of a school and what that looks like. And it's probably just like further cementing this kind of like prestige or name-based like new academic elite class system in our society.
Great. I'll just point out, John commented that UW eliminated, or we eliminated weighting schools in the review process years ago, and that's been a very good thing. I also, Rima had pointed out earlier, kind of in response to Nikki's comment, that her medical school would aggressively recruit from Ivy League schools and offer early admission to those graduates, which was shocking for someone coming from a state school. And John clarifies, we used to do weighting in full disclosure, but do not do it anymore.
Yeah, thank you so much for those comments. That's so true. I know Rima and I have talked about this. So frustrating. Yeah, the leaky pipeline is another, John also wrote a comment about like the leaky pipeline where we lose a lot of people along a long pathway, and that another area which I think I have heard or seen that disproportionately affects underrepresented minorities in medicine. I wish I'd had more specific data to present about that, but I do know that I have witnessed that, and have wondered about reasons for that. And I do imagine bias plays a huge role in terms of how students experience medical school. Yeah, and that there's holes. Ryan wrote, the pipeline has holes intentionally poked into it, which is also likely true. It's very frustrating for, yeah, just a lot of systemic change needed to see improvement of diversity in medicine. That being said, I think we all do still have an individual responsibility to try to eliminate bias and oppression and discrimination in our practices, and that knowing more about the challenges that students face and the barriers they face, we can at the very least be really conscious about how we are interacting with our learners, how we're writing their evaluations, how we are encouraging or mentoring them to succeed in a system that actively works against their success.
Great, thank you so much, Magna. I think we're right a little bit after 11:30, so I think we'll wrap up there. Thank you to our amazing health equity pathway residents, Magna, Michael, Connor, for this incredible session today, and Ryan for your leadership in the health equity pathway. Such important work and learning, and just feel really grateful to be present for this today. Yes, lots of gratitude in the chat. Hope everybody has a wonderful day, and a good rest of the week and weekend, and take care, everyone.